Well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Text Messages, a podcast out of First Christian Church of Huntington Beach. My name is Stephen Pate. I'm on staff of the church. I'm joined with our lead pastor, Scott Martin, and we are continuing a conversation on the various messages that we find in the text of Scripture. Now, Scott, in our previous episode, we talked a little bit about this time in the church calendar called Holy Week, which really is about that final week leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection. And we talked about the beginning of that, which is Palm Sunday, which is a really powerful scene in the Gospels that you walked us through. And we're going to continue in that conversation by looking at really Jesus' crucifixion and his death and sort of what that can teach us as we anticipate Easter Sunday and talk through that. So I thought we'd just jump in today. There's a lot of stuff to dive into, and it's a pretty heavy part of the gospel story. It really is. It's very sobering as we just think of what Jesus went through. But I want to jump to Matthew 26. This is one of the places that we read this story. And after the Last Supper, which is kind of where we ended in our previous episode, Jesus goes out to this place called the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays. And in that prayer is just really some powerful things. So I was wondering if you could just kind of walk us through that. What is happening in this scene in the gospel? Why is it significant? What really is Jesus going through as he begins to pray?
Yeah. To me, this has always been one of the most powerful passages in the entire Bible, really, not just the Gospels, but in the entire Bible, because it is so personal, it's so intimate, and it's Jesus. Like, you really see the emotion of what he's struggling with and what's happening and what's going on. And again, last time we talked about how there's that scene where Jesus goes into the temple and he cleanses the temple, and how that doesn't fit the mold of what you see as Jesus, because you typically see Jesus as, kind and caring, and he's really not that there. This, in the same way, I think kind of doesn't fit the typical mold you see of Jesus, because typically you think of Jesus as someone who's like calm and collected and like doesn't get rattled really and is not overly emotional. And you don't see that here. Now, what's interesting is when Matthew writes about it, one of the things that's important to understand is Matthew never describes Jesus as out of control. Jesus is always in control. So much so that the Garden of Gethsemane, if you go to Jerusalem now, or Israel now, you can go to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's actually just outside the city of Jerusalem on the slope of the Mount of Olives. So the Mount of Olives is just outside like the city gates. It's actually a really pretty view of Jerusalem if you stand on the top of the Mount of Olives and look at it. And from other places, it seems like it's a fairly typical hangout place for Jesus and his followers. Like they would rendezvous there at different points. So if Jesus really wanted to avoid getting arrested, he could have gone somewhere in hiding. He could have gone somewhere in secret. He could have like thwarted the whole thing. Yeah. But he doesn't. Like, he goes to a place where, because he's going to be betrayed by Judas, one of his followers. He's already Jesus has already identified that at the Last Supper, and Judas has gone off to bring the guards to arrest Jesus, and we'll get to that part in a minute. But Jesus is very much in control. And so even though during this whole prayer thing, he's very emotional, he's still very much in control, and he's in charge. And what he does, he ultimately does willingly. He kind of walks into it. But it's this really intimate picture of Jesus. After the Last Supper, he goes with his followers into the Garden of Gethsemane, which is probably like an olive orchard. That's in there, like a kind of a fenced off olive orchard thing. And he goes in there and he leaves most of his followers, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him. They're like his inner circle, his best friends. And he goes a little further and he asks them, he says, "Hey, can you watch out for me?" And really what he's asking him to do is, can you stay awake? Can you stay awake and just, sure, I just want to go and pray. And so he goes a little bit farther, and he starts begging God. He literally says, if you read it, says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death."
Wow.
I was thinking back yesterday as I was kind of going through preparing for this. I was thinking back in my life of some prayers that I've prayed that were pretty emotional times. Times where there was maybe loss or there was uncertainty. And I'm not sure I've ever prayed anything that like in that much anguish.
Yeah.
Or even in that much grief. I mean, that's heavy. My soul's overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And actually, if I remember right, actually, I think he says that to his followers. That's why he tells them to stay here. Yeah, he tells that verse 38. He actually says that to his followers. He tells them that's a heavy, like, to say that to your friends. Like if I was to say that to you, like, hey, Stephen, can you go to dinner tonight because my soul's overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death? Like that's heavy. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of the mindset of where Jesus is at right now. It's after he says that to them, then he goes further and he falls down to the ground and he begs God. He's like begging him, please don't make me do this. And the word he uses is, he says cup. He says, take this cup from me. Which cup is an interesting word in the Bible, in the history of Israel. In the Bible, it's used at different points kind of as a symbol of suffering, but also a symbol of wrath. So when you get to the book of Revelation, there's all those prophecies about, God pouring out his wrath. Like there's this picture, he's pouring it out. It's coming out of this container, and the cup is kind of what contains it. And like I said, even if you go back in the Old Testament, it's symbolic of suffering. Like, can I bear this cup that is my suffering? And Jesus is going to face both of those on the cross.
Yeah.
He's going to suffer and he's going to face wrath. And so he begs God in a very, very personal way, like, please don't make me do this. I don't want to do this. If there's any way, take this from me. And again, to me, it's a powerful depiction. Like it's really, really personal. But in the end, Jesus comes around and he says, but God, I want your will more than I want my way. I want to get out of this. This is literally tearing me apart. My soul's overwhelmed with sorrow. I'm grieved. I'm in anguish. I'm in all kinds of like stress and hurt and pain. But if you're telling me there's no other way, then I'll do it.
Yeah. Wow.
And it's a heartbreaking prayer when you read it. Like it really just is. And then the even more heartbreaking part is after he prays, he comes back and his friends have fallen asleep.
Yeah, like the whole thing is compounded by his closest friends in this moment of just, his pain, his anguish, and they're just like, taking a nap.
Yeah, which it's interesting because I'm trying to think, and I could be wrong on this, so don't quote me, but this is like the one place where Jesus really tells them, like, I need you. Like, I need you to be here for me right now. Because we all know, like in friendships and relationships, sometimes you do that. Like, you're just there for your friend. And even if you can't do anything, like just your presence is there.
Right.
And it's Jesus trusts his followers. He trusts Peter, James, and John. But this is like the one time that I can think of. And again, I could be wrong. I didn't do like a comprehensive search, but it's the one time I can think of off the top of my head that he tells them, I just need you to be here for me. And they can't even do it. They fall asleep.
Yeah.
He's crying. He's like pouring his heart and soul out, and his friends fall asleep.
Wow.
And he's obviously frustrated with that. And he tells them he's frustrated. And he gets into this interesting phrase where he's talking to them, and then he says, watch and pray so you're not falling into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And I kind of think what Jesus is getting at in that whole interaction is he knows these guys and he knows they're good guys. Like deep down, they're good. They're flawed, like all of us are flawed. I mean, they're flawed. Just they have, and he knows that with what's coming, they're going to want to be strong. But it's going to be hard. Yeah. And I don't think that's just in reference even to his crucifixion. I think it's what's going to happen after his crucifixion, even after his resurrection, as these guys kind of lead the early church. He just knows, like, it, as difficult as it may have been up to that point, it was about to get a whole lot harder for them for the rest of their lives. And so it's this encouragement to, hey, you're going to want to be strong. You're going to be tempted not to. You're going to be tempted. And I think he knows that they're going to face at some point what he's facing now. Yeah. You're going to want to find another way around it. You're going to want to find another way, like whatever it is they're going to go through in their life, you're going to want to find an easy way. But my hope for you is that you don't. Is that when you get to that moment where you're tempted to find an easy way because it avoids pain, it avoids suffering, it avoids hurt and uncomfortability, that he's like, hey, you'll stay strong. So he gives him that little encouragement. Then he goes out and prays again. Prays the same thing. Comes back, they're asleep again. He does it a third time. So he goes out and prays. So three times the guy goes out, pours out his soul, and all three times he comes back and his friends are asleep. And again, it's like, it's the one time he tells them, I just need you to be here for me. I just need you to be here. And they can't do it.
Yeah. Wow. It's a sobering reminder, just thinking through our own lives, where how many times the spirit's willing, but the flesh takes over. We've done the same thing. We've fallen asleep. We've turned, away at that crucial moment. It's kind of the story of all of us, just in sin and flaws. And I just imagine for Jesus, as you were saying, like, this scene really is putting his humanity on display. Like, I mean, this is a really honest, passionate prayer. Like, God, if there is another way, please let that be what happens. But ultimately he surrenders, but still just that emotional toil, like turmoil that he's going through. Just, I can't imagine.
Yeah. And you brought up a good point, because I do think this passage teaches us something about prayer, in terms of like the purpose of prayer. Because Jesus, the timeline of all this, when you look at the Gospels, it happens all throughout the night, and then Jesus will be on trial the next day. But there is like when exactly does he go on trial? But essentially he spends a big chunk of the night, if not the whole night, praying. And what he's praying for something very specific. And I know, like, sometimes in my own life, prayers are more generic and like, God, just whatever, be with the world, be with the church, be with my family. But sometimes you're like pinpointing at God, here's this situation, do something here. Jesus is incredibly specific. God, I want you to do something here. And ultimately, God doesn't do what Jesus asks. He doesn't, which for a lot of us, it would be like, well, my prayer didn't work. I prayed for God to do something about this health situation. I prayed for God to do something about this job or financial situation, and he didn't do it. So God didn't answer my prayer. But what's fascinating is when Jesus comes back the third time. So this is the end of his like whole night of prayer. When he comes back, the whole tone changes. Because again, remember, it starts when he tells his friends, my soul's overwhelmed to start at the point of death. When he comes back the first time, he says, look, the hour has come. Rise, get up, let's go. That's very different in language and in tone from my soul's overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. So Jesus has come out of this with like a renewed strength, a renewed passion, a renewed vision. So there's something that happens during that night of prayer that doesn't involve God actually like doing what Jesus wants him to do.
Yeah.
So I think prayer, one of the things I think you learn from this passage about prayer isn't so much about getting God to do what we want God to do, as much as it is about aligning ourselves to what it is that God wants to do in us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just because, hey, God didn't do what I asked him to do, doesn't mean prayer doesn't work or prayer is not effective. I believe prayer works. I believe God changes circumstances. I've seen it, I've experienced it. But I would say most of the time in my life, God doesn't do the things I ask him to do.
Right.
He just doesn't. That doesn't mean it doesn't work, though. Because I think we need to shift our mindset and say, hey, prayer's about me aligning myself to God's will, not about me aligning God to my will. And I think Jesus shows us that here. And this is where the story starts to get really crazy, I guess. I mean, not that it wasn't crazy before, but it starts to get super. Judas comes up and he greets Jesus with a kiss. And there's a lot that's made of that. I'm a big U2 fan, and they have a song called Until the End of the World that's all about Judas. And it's really a fascinating song. It's all about Judas and talks about how he betrays him with a kiss. Culturally, Jesus, you have to remember, Jesus is a rabbi.
Right.
And so he's a teacher. And there was like cultural protocol for a student, a disciple, to greet their rabbi with a kiss. It was a very special way to greet them. But you didn't do it unless you were invited to. Kind of like there's protocol. I mean, I couldn't tell you what it is, but like if you ever watch The Crown or any of that stuff, or there's like protocol for when you meet the queen. Like, here's what you do. You have to do this. I'm sure there's the same thing when you meet any dignitary. There's protocol for rabbis, and kissing like was the way you'd greet someone, but never without their like kind of initiating it or allowing it. So the fact that Judas just walks up and kisses him, and Jesus even responds on points, says like, you greet me by kissing me. It's really kind of disrespectful. So what you see in that kiss is you're seeing what Judas really thinks about Jesus at this point. And Judas is frustrated with him. I mean, Judas, what motivates Judas to finally agree to betray Jesus, we talked about the story a couple weeks ago in church, is there's a woman who breaks a jar of perfume and pours it on Jesus, and everyone's upset because it's really expensive and could have done something great with it. After that story is when we're told that Judas agrees to go out and betray him. So Judas is fed up with Jesus, and it's, you know, the way he runs things, the way he's leading. And the kiss is another symbol of that. The Judas is kind of like over it. He's like, hey, I don't believe who I maybe once thought that you were. I think this kind of whole thing is a sham. And so, yeah, that's why he greets him that way. But again, it's important to remember that even though Judas leads this scar, even though all this is happening, Matthew still presents Jesus as in control. Jesus could have got out of it at any moment.
Right.
He could have thwarted Judas' plan, but he didn't. He didn't at all. He walked right into it. And again, think about what he told his apostles after the prayer was over. Rise, get up, let's go. Here we go. We're going to do this.
It's action time. We're moving forward.
And so Judas comes in, and when he comes in, he's leading this. It's described as like just a crowd of armed people. Most scholars, if you look at it, assume that it's like the temple guards, temple police. They're coming to arrest Jesus. Kind of says a large crowd. But it's really difficult to imagine it's a large crowd, because at this point, the leaders are trying to do this. They're doing it like in the dark at night. They want it to be quiet. Like, we don't want to make a big deal about this. We don't want to start this. Like, let's do this quietly. Let's do this in the dark. And it's the temple leaders. It's the temple guard. Judas agreed to sell Jesus out to the chief priests of the temple. And that's just important to know, because a lot of times when you talk about the enemies of Jesus, talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are like the local religious leaders that would serve like in the synagogues, almost more like a pastor would now. The Pharisees at this point have been trying to kill Jesus for a couple of years. They don't like it, and they've got nothing. When Jesus crosses the temple, which is what he does at the beginning of the first week of his life, we looked at in our last podcast, when after the triumphal entry, he goes into the temple, turns the tables over. A week later, now they're going to kill him. Like, the temple is what has the power. Like, the Pharisees have influence with the people, but when it comes to like political power, the temple has it. So a week after he crosses the temple, now he's going to get killed. And that's what comes up over and over again at his trial. Like, he said this about the temple. He said that about the temple. You know, did you really say you could destroy the temple and rebuild it in a few days? And so this is the temple guard now, like the temple police, and they're coming armed. This armed mob to arrest him. And Jesus' followers now at this point, they want to fight. Peter pulls out a sword, which is interesting because you don't typically like think of the apostles as being armed. Like, we used to do at my home church, we used to do this big Easter like play pageant, I guess you would call it, called Amen. And we had all these like biblical costumes, and people would dress up as all the apostles and dress up as Jesus, and there was like songs, but none of them ever had like a sword or a knife or
right.
Like, that's, again, you just picture him as like these kind of passive people. But Peter here, he's got this thing on him. I mean, he's like ready. He's ready. He's excited. He's wanting to fight. And he's thinking, hey, this is the moment. We're finally going to do this. Cuts a guy's ear off. And then Jesus tells him, no, we're not. This is not how this is going. Heals the guy's ear and will not let his followers fight, even though they want to. Which is, it tells you something about Jesus. Again, he's in total control. Even if his followers couldn't have won, they could have started to fight back. He could have escaped and got away. But he does. He's no. This is, Jesus has said at one point, he said, no one takes my life from me. I give it willingly of my own free will. And he's proving that. He's in control. He's in charge, even in the midst of all this chaos. And he doesn't let them fight back.
And he's just having all of these like incredible, almost like little truths that he's like weaving in through the story, in that sense that he's in control. You know, when he says, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. I mean, he's denouncing violence, you know, as a way to, you know, live your life, you know, and to like find, your way to fight back. Like it's through sacrifice, it's through surrender. I mean, just incredible like moments you're seeing in his life. And I love the point that you're making of him being in control. Like he knew what he was doing, and he was guiding towards ultimately his sacrifice and teaching his followers to do the same.
Yeah, because there's, even as the story goes on, and we'll look at it, there's multiple opportunities and ways that Jesus could have got out of this. We're going to talk about when he goes before Pilate in a minute. Pilate's like trying to find a reason to let him go.
Yeah.
And like if Jesus would have just said the right thing, or that, like he could have got, but he never did. He walked right into it of his own choice, and he was in charge the whole time.
So this scene happens. He's arrested. He has these responses that he gives to this crowd, like, you're coming at me with clubs, you're coming at me in this way. You could have like taken me at any point. I was just teaching in the public, doing all these things. And then they do bring him before, the Sanhedrin, and then eventually Pilate. And then that kind of is the next section of this story. So you kind of mentioned that before. So now he goes before, the Sanhedrin and Pilate. And what kind of is happening there that leads to, again, his crucifixion and death?
Yeah, the when he's on trial, the Sanhedrin is the Jewish high council, and the kind of the leader is the chief priest of the temple, because we talked about the temple has all the power. What's interesting is it appears from, and again, there's not a whole lot of detail about it, but it appears that when they put Jesus on trial before the high priest and the Jewish Sanhedrin, they actually go to the high priest's house. That's what it says. They take him to the high priest's house. The Sanhedrin had gathered there. It's still kind of dark during the night, so it's night or like early morning, which all of that stuff is really unusual. Like you wouldn't usually go to the high priest's house. You wouldn't really. So it doesn't look like this is any kind of official trial. It's more of like, let's all get together and let's all agree on what we want to do so that we can go to the Romans with a plan. Because, and this is going to be important, that they want to kill him, but the Jews can't kill anybody. That's only because Rome, even though the Jews kind of have their own little leadership, they're still under Roman occupation. So Rome is the only one that's authorized to execute somebody. So if you want to execute somebody, you've got to get permission from the Romans. The Romans have to convict them. And so this is kind of like more so than it kind of is run like a pre-trial, but it's really a sham. I mean, the way that Matthew tells it, it's like they've trumped up all these witnesses and they're just saying all these different things, and they're just looking for a reason to kill him so they can get everybody on agreement. So when they go before the Romans, they can say, hey, we all agree. Like, this is what we want to happen. We can speak with one voice. Finally, what they get him on again is you have two witnesses that say he spoke against the temple. And the two witnesses is important because according to Jewish law, that's what you needed to convict someone. You need two Jewish, and at that, the council's satisfied. And they say, hey, okay, we got these two people. Here's the charges. We're all in agreement. This is against our law. It's against our custom. Let's take him to the Romans and ask them to kill him. This is also, by the way, just kind of a side note. This is the point at which you get that famous story where Peter denies knowing Jesus, which is again, another heartbreaking part. We're told that Peter follows at a distance, and Peter's kind of watching all this go down from a distance. And he's asked a few different times, hey, aren't you with him? Don't you know him? And all three times Peter says, look, I don't know the guy. I'm not with him. And then it ends with Peter weeping bitterly. Jesus, I mean, Peter at one point during the Last Supper told Jesus, hey, I'll die for you. Jesus says, dude, tonight you'll deny that you even know me. And it's this heartbreaking moment for Peter and even for Jesus.
Yeah, that really is. And there's also sort of the other heartbreaking moment of Judas, in his kind of aftermath, and Matthew tells us he goes and basically he kills himself, like in his regret and his remorse and just this pain. And so you have these two disciples kind of going different ways, but both just dealing with that rejection. That's really intense.
Judas, I mean, I know he's a villain, but in a lot of ways, he's always been kind of a tragic character to me. Like, it's really easy to villainize somebody. And I'm not trying to say that Judas should be a hero and we should look up to anything like that. But, Judas, maybe in some ways, like Peter, is probably kind of an emotional guy. And yeah, I mean, like you said, at that point, he's just overcome with guilt and he sees no way out. And it's just a tragic, I don't know, it breaks my heart when I read about Judas. Some people get angry again, I'm angry too. Like, there's a part of it that's angry, but there's a part of it that, man, you were with him and you missed it, and it wasn't what you expected, and you got angry and you got frustrated, and you went out and made a really dumb choice, and then you died with so much regret, and it's a brutal story.
Yeah, it is. So both of those scenes happen, Peter and Judas, and then we find Jesus before Pilate as sort of the next part of this trial.
Yeah, because Pilate now is the official Roman governor. So he's the guy there that's in charge of that region, and he's the one that can ultimately give the order to kill him. Now, what's interesting is when Jesus goes on trial before Pilate, the questions Pilate asks him, Pilate's far more concerned in Jesus' claim to be a king than anything Jesus said about the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Because if Jesus is claiming to be a king, that's a crime against Rome. That's a treasonous thing. The whole thing with the temple is more of a Jewish thing. And for Pilate, it's like, whatever, I don't care. Like,
right.
It's your religious thing, it's your Jewish thing. It's, that's not, he's more concerned of, hey, did you commit any crimes against Rome? Was there anything treasonous here that I should hold you? So Jesus and Pilate get into a lot of conversations about, are you a king? You claim to be a king. And Jesus either responds by saying nothing, or he responds really vague. Like, well, I don't know, you say that I'm a king, my kingdom's not of this world. And Jesus doesn't deny being a king. He doesn't give him like a great clear response.
Right.
And Pilate sees this, primarily from what we can tell, Pilate sees this as like a Jewish disagreement. And so he kind of doesn't want anything to do with it. It's like, hey, this is your thing. This is not a Roman thing. This guy hasn't really done anything wrong. Even Pilate's wife tells him like, hey, I had a dream. Stay out of this. Don't do anything. And so Pilate's trying to get out of it, trying to get Jesus off. But he can't. The Jewish people are so adamant. I mean, the religious leaders have done such a good job of bringing everyone together on these charges of, he's against the temple, he's against us as people, he's against our nation. We need to kill him. And for Pilate, the one thing he's really got to worry about is losing control of the people.
Yeah, there's this crowd, this mob, right, that's forming.
And if there's some kind of, uprising, if there's some kind of revolt, that could get him in trouble with Rome. And so even if he puts down the revolt, he might survive some kind of like uprising, but Rome might come in and get rid of him. So he's got that, like, there's what he wants to do and what he thinks is maybe the right ethical thing to do. But then, hey, as a leader who's charged with keeping the peace here, what do I have to do to keep the peace? So he comes up with this plan to try to get out of it. It was a custom for the Roman governor to release a prisoner to the Jewish people on because this all happens around Passover. And so he uses that custom. And he says, hey, here's two people. Here's Barabbas and here's Jesus. And Barabbas, we don't know a ton about Barabbas. We're told, though, that he's led a violent insurrection, which we look at that and go, okay, well, that means he's a bad guy. But you have to remember, if he led a violent insurrection, then more than likely it's a pro-Jewish insurrection that he led against the Romans.
Yeah.
So for some people, this is like a national hero. But this guy tried to overthrow the Romans. This is what we want Jesus to do. Jesus would never do it. And so when Pilate offers these two guys, one being this like peaceful, gentle Jesus, and the other this like violent, rebellious insurrectionist, the people who are already like politically charged and motivated are like, give us Barabbas.
Yeah.
And so then Pilate's like, okay, well, I gotta release Barabbas, this notorious criminal. Like, I almost think of him like a Robin Hood type of guy. Like he's breaking the law, but man, he's breaking it for the people, on behalf of the people. So they release Barabbas, and then you have just Jesus. And now Pilate kind of has no choice. In order to satisfy the crowd, in order to like stop there from being a rebellion, stop there from being anything gnarly, he just kind of has to give in to the wishes of the crowd. And he does it, from what we can tell, kind of reluctantly. But he does this little thing where he washes his hands, like he physically washes his hands, and even says, hey, his guilt, his blood, not on me, it's on you. You all have the choice. This is what you did. This is on you, which it's great to say that, but the reality is Pilate still has to give the order.
Yeah.
So like he symbolically washes his hand and tries to claim that he has no part of it. It's like, okay, you were still the one that gave the final stamp of approval. Yeah, execute this guy.
Right. Well, it's again just another powerful scene in this story, and there's so much in this, this text here, I mean, I might be reading into it a little bit, but it's interesting as you talk about Barabbas being released and the crowd sort of choosing, we don't want the way of Jesus. We want the way of, this guy that led the rebellion. Like that's who we want, to be our Messiah. We want that overthrowing of the political powers, and Jesus was like, that's not why I came. There's another enemy that I'm fighting against. It's not Rome, it's sin and death. And they miss it, they reject it. So that's interesting, just kind of that subtle commentary almost that's weaved in here by Matthew and the other writers.
Yeah, and that's a great point to look at it, is more than choosing two people, we're choosing two ways.
Yeah.
Two ways to approach life and reality. And yeah, that's really good. That's a good insight.
So this all happens, and then we of course get to Jesus's crucifixion. And I mean, we've talked already about really heavy scenes, really brutal scenes, and this one, probably is the top of all that. As we have details of crucifixion, that we know, like historically, what crucifixion was, and Jesus wasn't unique in being crucified. This was something the Romans had perfected, and that something they did on their enemies, and it was a very painful way to die. And so Jesus, he experiences this. So what could we say, maybe just a little bit about crucifixion and what that kind of meant, and what Jesus sort of went through, and maybe even just thinking like, why crucifixion, and why that was the way that, he was forced to die.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting to note is, as much as Pilate like washes his hands from it, Jesus is tortured before he's crucified. Like they beat him, and they do all that. Literally, it was they flog him, which to flog means, when you look at the word, like literally filleted to the bone. So none of that is a requirement before crucifixion. Now, it happened a lot. But so Pilate, like, as much as he tries to wash his hands of it, Pilate's still the one that not only gives the order to crucify him, but gives the order to torture him first. And that torture was so bad that sometimes people even died in the torture before they got to the crucifixion.
Wow.
Because like you said, the point of crucifixion, it's not the nailing that kills you. Like, you just hang up there, and eventually it's suffocation, because the way you're hanging down, you have to lift yourself up to breathe. And you get to a point where you just can't do that anymore. And so you suffocate. And it even would happen sometimes if you were up there for really long and you were surviving, then what they would do to kill you is they'd break your legs. They'd just come by with a club or something, I guess, and break your legs, because then you couldn't lift yourself up, and then you would suffocate and die. And so the point of it was to be an example. We tend to think of crosses as like super high. Roman crosses probably weren't all that high, but it was a way to put people almost on display as like, this is what's going to happen if you do this.
Yeah.
That's why it was reserved for people like Barabbas. Like, if you lead an insurrection against the empire, here's what's going to happen to you. And so it was a way to torture people. It was a way to warn other people. And that's what, ultimately, the people who initially started, the chief priests and all that, this was the form of death that they wanted, because they wanted that example. This is what happens when you stand against the temple. This is what happens when you stand against God. This is what happens when you stand against the people. You suffer and you torture, and you're made an example of. And through the whole thing, what makes it even worse is at every level, not only is Jesus getting beat and tortured, but he's getting mocked and made fun of. Guards are mocking him and making fun of him, and they're beating him, and people are telling him like, hey, you're supposed to be this Messiah prophet, prophesy who hit you, who was that? People are spitting on him. He's forced to carry the cross like to the site called Golgotha, which is where they actually crucify him. And all the way as he's carrying that, he's getting mocked. As he's up there on the cross, he's being mocked and made fun of. And so if it's, as if it's not bad enough that you're suffering, then you just throw all these people who were cheering for your pain and your suffering and your death and your demise. And it's awful. It's an awful picture. Like, even just to think about it, I can't imagine. And then when he's hanging on the cross, one of the things you see is he's hanging there between two criminals, and they hang a sign above him that makes fun of him that says, he's the king of the Jews. But then his mom and a few other women, and John, we're told, are there watching him. So I just like, my heart breaks for Jesus in that moment and everything that he goes through, but I can't imagine what it's like to be his mom in that moment.
Yeah.
And you're literally watching your baby boy go through all of this, and there's nothing you can do about it. And he's just a bloody, broken, spit on, beat up, ridiculed mess.
Mm. Yeah.
It's gnarly. And then
Wow.
the whole kind of climax of it is when Jesus is hanging on the cross, and Matthew records the words, some of the words Jesus says at the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I didn't know this, but that's the only time in the book of Matthew that Jesus addresses God without calling him Father.
Oh, interesting.
That every other time Jesus addresses to God, he refers to him as Heavenly Father, Abba, or Father, some term for that. But that's the one time where he doesn't refer to him as Father. He just says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so, like, it was bad enough when he was abandoned by his friends and they couldn't even stay away from him, but now he's experiencing all of this in isolation. And people wonder, what does that really mean? And people have talked about, and there's images of God abandoning him. I don't know exactly theologically what happens in that moment. Like, I don't exactly know what God's doing. I don't necessarily know that it's a statement that God had abandoned Jesus. Again, I just think here's Jesus as a human being enduring all of this. I mean, who of us, when you go through any kind of suffering or loss, hasn't at least had that thought? God has abandoned me. God has left me because I've experienced this loss. I've experienced this disappointment. I've experienced this pain. Has God abandoned me? And that's clearly what Jesus feels in that moment.
And it's almost like this full human expression of that pain, of that grief. That a lot of the Psalms, right, have that similar language of feeling that God isn't there and kind of crying out and wondering. And that's part of that human experience that Jesus fully had, like that he fully went through.
Yeah, it's because I think it's a statement that's full of isolation and agony. And the isolation, again, isn't just God. Again, he's got his mom and a few other people there, but predominantly everyone at this point has rejected him. And he's all alone, and he's going through this by himself. And then he gets to the point where he says, it is finished. And he bows his head and gives up his life. And he did what he came to do. No one took his life. He gave it up freely. He just said, hey, God, it's finished, and bows his head, and he dies. And when you read that part in Matthew goes on and says some interesting things. Matthew says that the moment Jesus died, the temple curtain was torn in two. And he talks about what always reminds me of, I don't know if you ever saw Ghostbusters, but there's that scene in Ghostbusters where they catch all the ghosts and they put them in that containment unit. And then the guy comes from the EPA or whatever and shuts off the containment unit. And then there's like ghosts all over town. Kind of what it sounds like Matthew's describing. Because it says, hey, there's like all of a sudden all these ghosts, the people from the dead, they're all over the place and they're in town. And it's really this weird scene. But Matthew's getting at, I think, a couple things there. The curtain of the temple, first of all, is what divides God from everyone else in the temple. It's most likely the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies, where God lived, from everyone else. So it's this barrier between God and people. So the fact that that's torn is pretty symbolic of now there is no barrier between God and people. Whatever barrier was there, Jesus took away when he died. And then the whole thing about this massive jailbreak from the grave, this shows you a couple things. One, it shows you that Jesus' death, somehow in his death, he breaks the power of death, because death is like the ultimate hold on people. Once, no matter how bad of a diagnosis someone may get, a health diagnosis, there's always as long as they're breathing, it's like there's always a chance, maybe a slim chance. You may only have a 0.5% chance, but there's always a chance. But once someone's dead, it's like, no, you're dead. It's over. That, there's no coming back from death. But when Jesus dies, all of a sudden, like, the power of death is broken.
Yeah.
And so I always picture it as like, it's like this massive jailbreak from the grave.
Mm.
All of a sudden, this thing that's had power on everyone for all time, now it doesn't. Now it's
Yeah.
like death doesn't have the hold that it used to have. And so there's this massive jailbreak from the grave. And it's just kind of a cool scene. But basically, it's this announcement that death has lost its grip. There's
Mm.
now something that has overcome death.
Mm. Oh, I love that. I love that imagery. And just thinking through that, as we watch Jesus go to this place of ultimately giving his life, and as we see what kind of happens right after that is his disciples and followers are like, well, it's over, right? It's done. Like he died, the movement, it stopped. Our leader, our Messiah, he didn't do the things that we thought he was going to do. So they scatter and they hide, but it's like, hold on. No, real change has actually happened through what he did.
Yeah.
Mm. That's powerful. Well, there's so much to kind of go from here, but I wonder if we could kind of wrap up with just this question, Scott, as we approach this Holy Week that we're in. And actually, when this episode releases, we're starting into Holy Week and moving towards Easter. Why do we want to reflect on Jesus's death and sacrifice? Like, what can we kind of learn from that? Why do we want to hit pause, I think, during this week, just to be reminded of that story? Maybe just kind of what are some takeaways that we could think through and pray through this week?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we talk all the time at the church. We've talked on this podcast on how, the sacrifice of Jesus, his death and resurrection, is really kind of the center of the biblical story. It's the center of human history. And so you could talk about the importance and the significance of that. But I think as we've been talking about this through like looking at Jesus as a human being and everything that he suffered, I think one of the things I would want us to realize is you cannot understand Jesus apart from his death.
Hmm.
And the same thing's true of his resurrection. But I had a grad school professor who pointed this out to me. I didn't know this, but in the Gospel of Mark, which is the first gospel, historically, the first one written down, the first, Matthew and Luke borrow a lot from Mark. And so one of the things that's interesting is in the Gospel of Mark, like Jesus keeps asking people, who am I? Who do people say that I am? He even asks his followers, who do people say that I am? But no one correctly identifies Jesus until he's hanging on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a guard that looks up at him and says, surely this man was the Son of God. And so there's this like subtle literary thing in there that Mark's kind of leading us to understand that you cannot understand Jesus without understanding his death. And so even when people talk about like, oh, I don't believe Jesus died and rose again, and he was a good this, he was a good that. And it's like, I want to go back to the gospel writers because they're the ones that lived through it. They're the ones that saw it. They're the ones that either were eyewitnesses or talked to the eyewitnesses. It's like what they said, what they communicated about Jesus is you cannot understand him apart from his death. This is so central to who he was and what he did and what he was about, that to take all his teachings, everything else, and divorce that from his death, you just can't do it. That, if you want to know who Jesus is, which is ultimately about, I mean, Paul calls Jesus the image of the invisible God. If you want to know who God is, you look at the crucifixion. And so as we try to live in connection with God, as we try to understand God, as we try to learn more about God, that has to be centered on the crucifixion, because that's where God shows us the most intimate picture of himself and who he is and what he's all about. Yeah,
I love that. And so maybe this Holy Week, this time of preparing for Easter, we could be intentional about let's look at the crucifixion. Let's spend some time just pausing before that scene, maybe reading even through that scene a couple times this week, and just reflecting really on what Jesus did and just the vulnerability of that, of sacrifice, of God's love that was so powerful that he was willing to give his son that way. And that could just be a place that prepares our hearts for what's coming on Sunday. There's a great little saying, it's Friday, but Sunday's a coming, right? Like we see the crucifixion, we feel that, but we know ultimately that there's hope, and that's what we're celebrating at Easter. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for walking through that. Thank you so much for your insight and teaching us those messages that we find in the text of Scripture.
Hey, thank you, man. It was fun.
Yeah, it was. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening, for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you on Easter, whether you participate in person or online. We can't wait to celebrate with you. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next time.
Hey, love you guys. Take care.